Good morning. This is Commandments of the New Testament, episode 27, and we're in the section concerning. Where's my iPad? Oh, Pookie, can you get my iPad and unplug it off the counter there and bring it over here? Papa is unprepared. The Thank you, honey. The correct version. I know that some of you have multiple versions of this thing on your computer or your iPhone or your Android phone or whatever you've got. Where am I here? There we go. On the first page, if you turn to the very first page, the cover, if you will, right below the nuts and bolts, it should say revision 10, 14, 17. And that way you know you've got the correct version for this study. See it there? Got the right version? Yours won't load? Yeah, bring it to Jennifer. John 15:14, you are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Jesus said this, and he did not say, you are my friends if you believe in me. You are not. He did not say, you are my friends if you accept the grace of God in your lives in my name. He said, if you do whatever. Whatsoever means everything. Whatsoever I command you means everything. You are my friends if you do everything I command you. Whatever I command you. So, with that, let's start with judgment. We are in a section, we're actually in the second section of judging, concerning judging others. Judging others. The culture that we live in, and it's probably not limited to the culture that we enjoy in America, but all of the world now, and we'll get there momentarily. All of the world is pretty much laid out the same way. They have a very different idea of judging others. It's very popular worldwide right now to be tolerant. You've heard the word tolerance. And the idea of tolerance brings us to different kinds of conclusions than we would have come to in the old days, when I was a kid, when I was growing up in the church. Our idea of tolerance was completely different than the one that is espoused today. Sometimes, for instance, sometimes the nicest people are the people covered in tattoos. And sometimes the most judgmental people you meet go to church on Sundays. This is a kind of a common thing, and it's not something that has happened by accident. I'm not talking about a conspiracy here, but it's interesting to me that on television and in movies, we are constantly seeing church people, particularly pastors, as the bad guys. As the bad guys. They are dishonest. They are holier than thou, and yet terribly flawed more than anyone else. And it's kind of leaked over into our belief system as a society worldwide, because these movies and these TV shows do go worldwide, and it tends to affect us in the same way. Church people, specifically Christian people, are bad people. They are judgmental at the very least. That's a diplomatic way of saying that they are more flawed than I am, who am not a Christian. The nicest people that you meet are covered in tattoos. You've got to ask yourself, now as believers, the thing that you should ask yourself first of all when faced with something like this, and you don't have to be vocal about it. If someone were to say this to you, the first thing you should think of is, can a nice person also be a dangerous person? There are a lot of nice people that I've known in my life that I have no doubt are going right to the hells of the lake, the hellfire, lake of fire, Gehenna. They are not Christians. They are far from being Christians, but they're nice people. Nice is not the objective. Not for Christians and not for non-Christians. We've become enamored with nice in our culture. I don't know whether I've ever talked to this before, but that's what liberalism is all about. Liberalism in the United States today is not simply a political party or a political way of thinking. It has come about as the result of a decision, a conscious decision on the part of the liberals to be nice people. They want to be recognized as being nice, forgiving, tolerant, easygoing, as opposed to the conservatives, who are none of these things in their estimation. The conservatives are not concerned about being nice. They are often pictured as being more concerned about being successful, but that's not necessarily true. Conservatives, by and large, are more interested in following the rules. Now, I have a natural bias about these things because I grew up in the hippie generation. And in the late 60s and early 70s, the hippies were a phenomena, and we've grown up with their attitudes, free love and question all authority, and on and on and on. The whole idea is that the world was a mess and the hippies were going to fix it. Well, liberalism is the result of the teaching of the hippies. They wanted to be recognized as being nice people, regardless of what they looked like, regardless of what they smelled like, regardless of the intent of their heart, regardless of the outcomes of what it is that they were espousing and encouraging other people to do. Regardless of all of these things, they wanted to be nice people. If you had to identify as a person now, individually, and I'm not asking for a show of hands here, just think about it for a second. What is the objective of your life? Now, I'm not talking about heaven or hell. I'm not talking about the goal or of the place, the destination that you wanted to be headed toward. If you wanted to be recognized as someone, or if you wanted to experience something here on earth, what would your goal be? Now, a lot of people would say money, wouldn't they? I want money. A lot of people that have money are not as enamored with money per se anymore. They're more enamored with power. Power comes from having money. And once you have money, you want power. That's the next step. But setting those things aside for a minute, what is it that you want? What's the most important thing to you in life? The conservatives, by and large, as well as the liberals, have the same personal goal. And it's stated in our Constitution. The pursuit of happiness. We want the happiness that comes by our pursuit. That's what we're working for, happiness. And I think I've mentioned before that as Christians, as believers, we should not have the same objective as the rest of the world. Whether conservative or liberal, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, if you're interested in what God thinks is important, then you shouldn't be interested in happiness. Happiness is not the objective for a believer. Peace is the objective. Now, you can have peace without having happiness. If you have happiness, like money, it's simply not enough. It's simply not enough. But peace is an end. Peace is an end in and of itself. Once you have peace, if you are a believer, that's the end. That's the last stepping stone on the path. You've achieved what it is that you are going for. Happiness also leads to materialism. Once you are happy, you want to go further than happy. And happy breeds materialism and mammonism and the desire for wealth so that you can also be at ease. You want to be happy, and the way to maintain happy is to have ease in your life. Well, ease is another way of describing peace. And it doesn't have to happen with money. You don't need power. You don't need all of those things. And you don't need happiness, frankly, to have peace. I won't get into a long dissertation on this because this isn't the objective of where we're going this morning. But think about this in that context. Sometimes the nicest people you meet are covered in tattoos, and sometimes the most judgmental people that you meet go to churches on Sundays. Judgmental people in churches, and again, this is my personal bias, having grown up in the hippie generation. I was very clean cut, by the way. I wasn't a hippie. I was the opposite of the hippie.
So you had short hair back then.
Yes, I did. As a necessity to distinguish myself, perhaps. But I was always clean cut. I was always nicely dressed. Today, it has become the fashion, I think, for especially for young people, high school and young college kids, to dress really, really sloppy. Have you noticed this? They dress almost in rags on purpose. Their culottes, if you want to call them that, are hanging around their knees so that their underwear shows. This is a common kind of a thing. This is very fashionable now, to look sloppy. Yes, derelict, yes. The idea, and I don't know where this comes from, but regardless of how you dress or who you are or the intent of your heart, regardless of these things, don't get into the habit of assuming that the old proverb, you can't judge a book by its cover, has any truth in it whatsoever. You can judge a book by its cover, because its cover is the context of the rest of the book. Now, it's true that a book all by itself can be anything inside, regardless of the cover. But a person has judgment, whether they want it or not. If someone has shaved themselves bald, they've covered their body in tattoos, and they've got piercings all over them, that person is, at the very least, trying to identify with another certain group of people. They want to tell the world that they belong to this group over here. This becomes the desire of their heart. If they didn't want to belong to that group, they wouldn't do this to themselves. Furthermore, if they do tattoos and piercings and things like this, which tend to have a permanent flavor to them, they have made a decision that this is what they want for the rest of their lives. You don't see someone like this do these things for any other reason than to identify themselves with a certain group of people. So when you see these things, you can tell an awful lot about that person by how they dress, how they mark up their body, and the tattoos that they put on themselves. You don't get a tattoo except to to tell the world something about you, even a hidden tattoo. Everybody knows it's hidden, but everybody knows you got a tattoo because you'll tell them. That's the whole point. You're trying to tell the world something about yourself. You're trying to identify yourself as someone that is recognizable by that mark. By the clothes that you wear, by the way that you smell. There are a lot of people who smell bad and a lot of people that smell way too good, if you know what I mean. There are a lot of people that don't smell. And that's a fashion statement too. Now, these are not religious issues. These are judgmental issues. When you meet someone that is tattooed up and has got a foul mouth and has got body piercings all over them, these things tell you something about that person. They provide the context for understanding that person and how they're likely to react in difficulty. Now, I say that with a purpose. We often act the way we want people to perceive us. We tend to be two-faced to a lot of the world, and you know that this is true. We often act the way that we want people to think of us. We act in a way that we will be perceived positively from the context of what we consider to be positively. You with me so far? Your true self, the truth about who you are and what you are inside, rarely comes to the surface of this persona that you attach to yourself. It tends to only happen in anger. In anger. For some reason, when you are angry, your true self comes right to the surface. Have you ever noticed that? And who you are is suddenly revealed to the whole world when you become angry. The more angry you become, the more emotional you become, the more likely this is to happen. If you were on board an airplane with 100 other people on this airplane, and suddenly you feel big bumps and lots of jerking around. The pilot says one of the wings just fell off the plane. We're all going to die. At this moment, all you've got to do is glance around the plane, and you can tell an awful lot about all of these nice people that were sitting in the seats a moment ago. There will be somebody that is cursing sitting right next to you, loudly, and they can't even help themselves. It's like suddenly they develop Tourette's. Accounts of this happening on airplanes and in natural disasters when people know that they are going to die. You would think that at that moment they'd fall on their knees, but no. Their true self comes right to the surface. It's kind of a scary thing that there is that kind of person down underneath all of these things. So, can a nice person be a dangerous person? Yeah, I know a lot of nice people who I would never have done business with because I knew better than to do business with a dangerous person. I still am very, very clear with myself about that. I will not become personally involved, let alone yoked in some kind of business arrangement with a dangerous person. And I've got my own ideas, what constitutes a dangerous person. Each of you will have your own ideas too. Don't judge someone just because they sin differently than you. This is also these statements are made by people who are obviously rebelling against the concept of judgment of themselves. Whenever somebody says, well, judge not lest you be judged, the reason that they're saying it is because you just hit a nerve. Pastor Chuck Smith used to say, when you throw a rock into a pack of coyotes, the one that yelps the loudest is the one that got hit. And there's a lot of truth to that, isn't there? So when somebody says, judge not lest you be judged, to you, you just hit somebody with a rock. You just hit a nerve with that person. They don't want to be judged. And they know that there's truth in what you just said, but they don't want to be judged. So that's their response. And they think that they are justified in that response. They think they're even biblically justified in that response. Don't judge someone just because they've got a different sin, unless they're a believer. Unless they're a believer. If they are or claim to be a Christian, then you have a duty, a God-given commandment to do this. You do judge someone else for a sin that is different than your own. The only caveat is if it's the same sin that you are yourself involved in, then you need to take care of your own sin before you judge them. Before you bring it to their attention, anyway. You can't judge my choices without understanding my reasons. You just don't understand. That's why you're so upset about judging me. When the wrong choices are made, even for the right reasons, they are still the wrong choices. The end does not justify the means. Now, I grew up post-World War II, and for me, that phrase, the end doesn't justify the means, may have a different significance than to some of you young kids. In World War II, when World War II was over, they held the Nuremberg trials against Nazi Germany. And over and over again, the heads of concentration camps were brought and asked to somehow explain what it is that they did when they massacred Jews, handicapped people, and Christians by the millions. They just slaughtered them, they executed them, but more importantly, they exterminated them. The intent was to wipe them out. They call it the Holocaust. To a single one of them, their only excuse was, I was following orders. It was for the greater good of the country as defined by Hitler. I'm not the guilty party, you have to blame somebody else. The answer of the Nuremberg court every time, and it was front page stuff for years, the end does not justify the means. You cannot justify doing what it is that you did by the result at the end. These are not stepping stones. You have to take each one and have a specific justification for that. You cannot judge my choices without understanding my reasons. The reasons being the end objective, and the choices that you make are the things that you did in order to get you there. You cannot justify your choices by the reasons that you had. The wrong choices, whenever they are made, even for the right reasons, are still the wrong choices. People will buy this. They'll hear that and they'll think, oh, that's nice. I like that. I'm going to have that tattooed on my arm. Wouldn't they? Or on my shoulder back here, so that if I go sleeveless, people will see it. And they'll ask me about it. And then I can tell them all about how right that is. It's wrong. It's flat out wrong. And you don't have to be a Christian to see that. I like this one because it sounds so good when you say it. It just kind of rolls off the tongue. Listen to it. Judging others makes us blind, whereas love is illuminating. By judging others, we blind ourselves to our own evil and to the grace which others are just as entitled to as we are. It sounds good. But it's a bunch of baloney, folks. Every line of it is categorically wrong. Wisdom, think about this for a second. The definition of wisdom is good judgment. You can't have good judgment without wisdom, and you can't have wisdom without good judgment. Wisdom is good judgment. Love is blind. Either accidentally or on purpose, love is blind. Oh, you can say, well, love is forgiving. But that's the same thing as saying you are purposely blind in order to be in love. And no one is entitled to grace. What's the definition of grace? It's unmerited favor. Unmerited, capital letters, unmerited favor. You aren't entitled to it. That's the whole definition of the word. But when you say it like this, it sounds like all of us are entitled to the same kind of grace. No, we're not entitled to grace. If we were entitled to it, it wouldn't be grace. But it sure rolls off the tongue. So judging others makes us blind. No, judging others is illuminating. Love is illuminating. No, love is blind. They simply reversed both of those things. We're supposed to, let me touch on that for just a second because I know that I haven't talked about this before. The Jews had what we call a national relationship with God. When God laid down commandments, they affected all of the nation of Israel. Many of the commandments caught up the entire nation, regardless of whether each individual person in the nation was guilty of violating that commandment. For instance, when they went to war and God told them in the first place, nobody touch any of the spoils of the battle. If somebody, and this happened, several times in the pages of the Old Testament, somebody would take something that was gold and they'd put it in their pouch and they'd sneak off with it. The whole nation was found to be in sin because of that man's covetousness. And the whole nation needed to sacrifice in order to get rid of that sin. This was a national relationship that they had. You and I do not have a national or any other group relationship with God. We are each of us held individually accountable. So our nation is us alone, personally. If our father did that, stole gold when God told him that you weren't allowed to touch the gold, then he would be guilty, but I wouldn't, right? Not just because I'm his son or because I belong to the same family. But there are several occasions where in the Jewish relationship, the Old Testament relationship that the Jews enjoyed with God, the children of Israel were responsible for the sin of what someone else did, the sin of someone else. No one is entitled to this grace. Love, and this is an important concept, is something that we are called to. When we are called to love, we all know, down deep in our hearts, even if we won't admit it, that we can't love everybody. We can't love everybody, at least not the way that you and I define the word love. When the King James translators decided that they were going to translate verses regarding love all men, love all of your brethren, brethren meaning those who belong to the church of Jesus Christ. I can't even love all of the brethren, let alone all men, right? They didn't use the word love, did they? In the King James Version, they used the word have charity or some form of charity. Charity is what we are supposed to lavish on all men. Charity is what we are supposed to give to all of the brethren, not love. Now, Strong's, in particular, equates the two, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think the distinction between charity and love is important. It's the same as this global identity, this national identity that Israel had under God in the Old Testament. When I say, I just love Canadians. I love Canadians. Or, I love Americans. Right? What I'm doing is I'm identifying Americans, not each individual American, but Americans as a group of being different kinds of people, different cultural beliefs, different political parties, different objectives than the rest of the world. So if I say I love America, I am speaking of the people in America on a national basis, the same way that God spoke about the Jews in the Old Testament on a national basis. How many people have you ever heard say, I love America? It happens a lot. We sing the national anthem, My Country 'Tis of Thee, and so forth, and there are lots and lots of poems that have been written, and we are encouraged, especially in grade school, growing up. Man, we said the Pledge of Allegiance every day, hand over our heart, standing next to our desks. No, that's not done anymore. If we do sing the national anthem, we leave off the last sentence because that's unacceptable anymore. That's not politically correct. So we don't do that anymore. But when it comes to love, you can love someone individually or you can love a nation. You can love a group. Not because you can love each and every person individually in that group, but you love what the group stands for. You love what the group signifies. You love the idea of all of those people wanting to be in that group. So when we say love, there are two ways that we can love. And it doesn't mean loving all Christians or loving Christians doesn't mean that we have to love each and every one of them individually. Many of those people we will never meet. So how could we love them? And frankly, folks, you cannot love someone that you do not know intimately. Intimately. We should be more aware of that now in these days of Facebook and Twitter than anybody in the past. I mean, the objective is to have as many friends as possible. How many friends do you have on Facebook, Steve? Well, it's a game almost, isn't it? People can tell you, I have over 700 friends now. Or my website has thousands of hits.
10 followers.
Wow. Jesus only had 12. Well, no, actually, he had thousands, didn't he? He only had 12 in his inner circle. You cannot love someone that you don't know intimately. You cannot be a friend to someone that you don't know. And if you don't know them, you can't call yourself a friend. But today, friends means something different than it did when I was a kid. Today, a friend doesn't even have to be an acquaintance. Do they? I mean, you can be a friend on a global basis. I like that guy and all of his followers. Well, you don't know all of his followers. How can you say that? The answer is because we've defined the term differently today than it used to be defined. I like this one. If judgment did not exist, honesty would run rampant. Where honesty is rampant, so is respect and understanding. Where there is respect and understanding, there is love. It sounds great, doesn't it? If judgment did not exist, chaos would be rampant. Get rid of the police, get rid of the courts, get rid of the government. You would have people stealing, murdering. There would be no limit to the amount of chaos that we would be living in. Mad Max comes to mind. We'd be living in a post-apocalyptic society, and it would be, but then other small governments would rise up too. A feudal kind of a thing would happen as we searched for order to pull us out of this chaos. If judgment did not exist, honesty is not the result, is it? You get rid of the courts, you get rid of the police, you get rid of the government, you get rid of all of authority, and honesty is not going to result. The opposite is going to happen. Respect and understanding cannot exist without judgment. Respect and understanding cannot exist without judgment. And I like this one. We can judge others or we can love others, but we can't do both at the same time. Again, this sounds great. Sounds nice. You can't love somebody if you're going to be judgmental of them. Love cannot endure without judgment. You cannot have love without judgment. If you throw judgment and the need for it out the window, you also throw the whole concept of love out. It's just like Facebook. I don't know these people, but they're my friends. I love America. Well, I don't love that guy, and I don't love that political party, but I love America. I like this one too. This is what he is saying here is, hey, judge not lest you be judged. Know what I mean? Would you let your daughter date this guy? Can you see this, Jennifer? This is think about, you can't judge a book by its cover here. Right? This is the guy that you want to take on as a partner in your business.
His name probably starts with honest something.
Yeah, honest Bob, or yeah. This is going to be the treasurer of your company, yeah. And labels. Hate them. They take all the mystery out of the packaging. This is a bottle of poison. You take the label away, and then it's up to you to test the contents, right?
It's like if you don't have your toothpaste and your lotion label.
This is think about that guy that I started out talking about, the one with all of the tattoos and the piercings and the bald shaved head and the foul mouth and all of this stuff. You can tell a book by its cover. You take that cover away and you're going to have to experiment without the context. Just as you take the poison label off this bottle, the only way you're going to know what's inside is by testing it. And that could be disastrous. So we should look for the context, the external context of a person in order to determine who and what they are. It still requires the knowledge of that person, the intent of their heart, what they are doing and what they are thinking inside before we can truly know them as either a nice person or as a good Christian believer or anything else that we would assume about that person. We certainly need to know more than simply the outside context of a person, the label, if you will, before we decide that we can love that person. Nevertheless, if the context is bad, that person is clearly trying to be part of a different group than I am interested in. And therefore, I can make a judgment call. Now, when it comes to the judgment call, I want to make one other determination here for you. I want to help you with this thing. It's important for us not to spread this around. When we make a judgment call about somebody, when we judge someone, and I'm not talking about believers here, I'm talking about non-believers. Lots of those folks out there, or a lot of people that we don't know whether they're believers or not. When we make a judgment call, it is up to us to keep it to ourselves. We don't share this. When you decide that that person is not an appropriate person for me to hang around with, that person is dangerous, and I don't want to be involved with that person. I want to avoid that person. That guy, I wouldn't want my daughter to date. Regardless of what judgment call you make, and you do need to make a judgment, when you make your judgment, if it is not a believer, you keep it to yourself. You do not share your judgment with somebody who is not a believer. When it is a believer, when that is a Christian, it is our duty to do one of two things. There are two paths. When we see something in a believer that is an absolute contradiction to Christianity, an absolute violation of one of the commandments of God, and we know it, we can see it, and it's amazing to us that nobody else has called them on it yet. You have one of two paths that you can follow, and both of them are equally valid. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. You can do one of two things. You can either pursue church discipline, and we'll get to that in the next section, or you can drop it. Walk away, no harm, no foul. You're not excusing it, but you avoid that person in the future. You don't hang around with that person. You personally, and you do not, if you take that path, share it with anyone else. If you share it with someone else, anyone at all, you have just entered into church discipline, and you have to see it through to its course. That's what church discipline is. Now, we won't get into church discipline right now, but let's talk about this for a second. Wisdom is good judgment. Wisdom is good judgment. What did Solomon say?
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, or wisdom is the beginning, yeah. What you said, Steve. Wisdom is good judgment. If I get wisdom, I will have good judgment. Solomon prayed when he arose to the throne. He prayed to God that instead of riches or wives or lands or power, God would give him wisdom so that he could judge his people properly. Judgment is the result. It is tied hand in hand. It is the Siamese twin of wisdom. Yes, honey? Okay. So wisdom is good judgment. That's what it means. If you want good judgment, if you want to develop wisdom in yourself and good judgment, you read Proverbs. Get to it. Proverbs. That will teach you wisdom. You can pray for it, and God will send it to you. But the book of Proverbs is there to make us wise. So if you want wisdom in your life, if you want good judgment, read Proverbs. If you want to learn to love God more, that's your objective. If you want to love God more and by extension love all men, which is what God called us to do, then you read Psalms. Read it through. You will learn more about God, the Father, His plan, and what He wants us to know in Psalms than almost any other book in the Bible. and it's condensed, so you have to kind of take it slow. Don't read fast. Proverbs, you can't read fast. Proverbs, you have to take one verse at a time. There is no context in Proverbs, which is an interesting thing from a Bible study point of view. You read one verse, and you have to stop and think about that. And you come to a conclusion about that one verse. The next verse has nothing to do with the verse before or after it. Each verse is a thought. So there is no context. In Psalms, there's lots of context, but you have to take it slow in order to develop the context and what's inside of it, one verse at a time. But beyond that, we should judge men as God judges, by the intent and the convictions of their hearts. Now, if I have a conviction in my heart about something, it means that I have an objective in my life that might be different from someone else's objective. If my objective is peace and someone else's objective is money or power, you can see that we are not compatible, right? It doesn't matter what the intent of their heart is, the conviction of their life, the conviction, the decisions that they've made about the goals and objectives and the aspirations of that person are simply not compatible with mine. You cannot love someone who is that incompatible. I told my daughter and my sons, in no uncertain terms, that you never go out on a date. You heard this too. You never go out on a date with someone who you are not, at this moment, mind you, who you are convinced that you would never marry. Now, you don't know them enough to make that decision yet, but if you already know that you would not marry that person, you don't go out on a date with them. Dates are not for fun. Dates are a mining experience. Pick and shovel time. You're digging. You're trying to find the right person. That's what a date is for. It is not enjoyment. There's enjoyment associated with it, but only in discovering someone that has the same convictions that you do. The intent of their heart is generally involved with the convictions of their character. If their convictions, if their goals, their aspirations have to do with money and power, then the intent of their heart will be to those stepping stones that lead them to that goal. If it's peace, God's peace, that you're interested in, then the intent of your heart will be along a different path. You see what I'm saying? So you pick and choose your relationships, and it's not just dating relationships. The relationships that you have as a person with other persons, individuals, are going to have to follow this same line of thought, whether you are conscious of it or not. If you find someone who is absolutely contradictory to you in their goals, you don't try to make it work. You don't try to change them. That's a disaster in the making, isn't it? Especially when it comes to fundamental convictions. We do not make people Christians. We do not convert people to Christianity. What does the Bible say about that? Who converts a sinner to Jesus Christ? The Holy Spirit. And only the Holy Spirit. You can be a witness. You can tell people what you have experienced. You can tell people about what your convictions and your intents along that path are. But if they come to a saving understanding of Jesus Christ, it has nothing to do with you. Don't try to take the credit for it. Oh, I've converted a couple dozen people to Christ. I'm going to have a special place in heaven. Boy, you just blew it big time, didn't you? The Holy Spirit makes Christians, not people. I've talked to a lot of pastors who see their job as making more sheep, rather than feeding the sheep that God has given them in their flock. Feeding the sheep is something that Peter was even called to, right? After Jesus' resurrection. Remember when Jesus said, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? 3 times. And each time he said, then feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. Just so that he wouldn't miss the point. Feed my sheep. And there are way too many pastors out there that are simply trying to make more sheep. And that's their goal. Let's fill these pews so full that we need a bigger church building. And then we'll take offerings until we have enough to... Bigger barns. Bigger barns. We should judge men as God judges, by the intent and convictions of their hearts. And that's true. That's true. I'm all for that. However, it should be used to identify dangerous and dishonorable people or situations, both of which we should avoid. Judgment, judging other men, should be done so that we can identify dangerous and or dishonorable people or situations that we should avoid. A dangerous person or a dangerous situation or a dishonorable person. And I'm talking about either Christians or non-Christians. There are a lot of people out there that call themselves Christians, aren't there? And that doesn't make them either nice, honorable, or heaven-bound, just because they call themselves Christians. When I was growing up, there were a lot of older people, grandparent-style people, who were convinced that they were Christians. They'd never been in a church, but they were Christians because their grandmother was a Christian. It's like I inherited it. And when somebody says, will all the Christians raise their hands? They would have raised their hand. And there are still people like that today. You ask for a show of hands and their hand would be right up there with everybody else's. They have no idea what it means. Now, this doesn't mean we need to noise this around about them, but we need to make a judgment call ourselves. If someone has consciously decided, I'm a Christian, but I don't have any need for Jesus, what are... Just, that boggles the mind. But it's not up to you and I to change them except by church discipline. That's the one path that God gave us through Jesus in the book of Matthew and confirmed throughout the epistles. Church discipline. That's how you either accept someone in, get them cleaned up because they're filthy, or you cast them out. The only remaining path is that you personally avoid them from this point on. And the Bible is pretty clear about that too. We're not even allowed to eat with them. We are not even allowed to eat with them. Okay. Our judgment of the unbeliever now, of the unbeliever, should be for our private benefit and should not be shared. The unbeliever. Anything else is either slander or gossip. And there's a real blurry line between those two things, isn't there? Slander or gossip. And we do not do that if we are Christians. Right? With our cookies and milk. Slander and gossip is not something that we get into. We are not called to that. In fact, just the opposite. So, if we come to a conclusion about someone or some situation, believer or not, who is either dishonorable, dangerous, or the situation that we are in when we are with them is either of those things, avoid them. There are occasions where church discipline in these times simply would not work. Simply would not work. Now, when I say church discipline, let me clarify that for just a minute. Most of you know what a court of law is. This is not a court of law. Church discipline is rather binding arbitration. Binding arbitration. Now, a binding arbitration is where you both parties to a conflict, you've got a problem that you need to solve. Both of you are convinced you're in the right. You choose someone else to be the arbiter. And the arbiter is the guy who listens to both of you, hears you out completely, and then makes a judgment call. They're the ones who say, you're wrong and you're right. Or you're both wrong. You have to both adjust your attitudes. But the arbiter is the outside party that can look in and see this thing from the outside in. That's what arbitration is. That's what church discipline is, too. So when we go to church discipline, the first step is to decide on who the arbiter is going to be. Well, Jesus made this real easy for us. What? Well, no. In church discipline, we simply take another Christian with us, or two, or even three. We take them with us, and they become what Jesus called the witnesses. They become the arbiters, if you will. You get to choose the arbiter. So church discipline starts out this way. We go to that other person with two or three witnesses. And Jesus says of that situation, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, there will I be in the midst. And this is not a flowery promise. This is a threat, isn't it? This is a binding arbitration as far as Jesus Christ is concerned. That's a scary place to be. You don't want to be wrong in that. And that's generally how it should be explained to everybody before you discuss the matter, when you brought your two or three witnesses along. If one of the parties simply will not hear the judgment of those two or three witnesses, that arbitration has failed. Then you take it to the church. Which church? That's where church discipline tends to break down these days, when we take it to the church. Not because churches have different opinions, but because, frankly, pastors are scared to death to be a party to church discipline. Lawsuits come of this, and they don't want to be part of a lawsuit. Lawsuits involving libel and slander, and because the disgruntled party is going to simply go to another church. In the early days of the Christian church, if you were banned from one church, it was not just permissible, but it was important to pass the word along to all of the other churches. And they, by tacit agreement, would also ban this person. You were no longer part of the body of Christ. And you couldn't get in any place. Today, you can walk around the corner and get into that church, and they don't ask. They don't tell. Oh yeah, that's their objective. Get those pews. Get them there. Get them full. That's their objective. We live in a really weird time as Christians. So, church discipline will have a tendency to break down once it gets to the church. But before that, we can take two or three witnesses. The witnesses may have a problem. It may be tough to get 2 or 3 witnesses that are comfortable entering into church discipline. But that's a different question. At least you have some control over that, and you don't need approval from the other party to do this. Okay. I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to close with that. Let's let's close in prayer, and we'll pick this up next time. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, O my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. Let it be a sweet, sweet sound in your